Thank you, Mr. President. It's another time for me to be back on this floor again to talk about an issue I've talked about before, but it is a little bit different this time. I've brought to this floor several times and asked for unanimous consent for a very, very simple bill called the Conscience Protection Act. Now, the Conscience Protection Act is a bill that would protect religious liberty and freedom and conscience benefits for healthcare workers across the country. It's really not that controversial. In fact, let me show you how non-controversial this really is. And the church amendments years ago, decades ago even, were put in by Congress to be able to protect the conscience rights of individuals and entities that object to performing or assisting in an abortion or a sterilization in violation of their religious belief and conscience. That passed this body 92-1. Okay, 92-1, this body voted and said, of course, we want to protect the rights of individuals to not have to be compelled to perform an abortion if it is against their moral faith. That seems normal. And in normal conversation everywhere else, that would be straightforward and simple. Until now. Here's what's happening now. A nurse that had told her employer that she did not want to perform an abortion, that she had a moral objection to that, worked in this hospital. One day the hospital was running short on staff, and so they called her in, didn't tell her what the procedure was, and when she walks into the surgery area, the doctor looks at her and says, "Don't hate me." Meaning, we know full well what your belief is, but we're short-staffed and we need another nurse. You're going to do this. The hospital informed her, "You'll lose your job if you don't do this right now." When everyone knew what her moral conviction was. Now, the way that the law is set up, it is set up to say for that person who's had an entity deliberately violate her moral conscience, then the government steps in and presses against the employer and says, you can't do that. That's the way it's supposed to work. In fact, that's the way it was working until Javier Becerra came in to HHS, looked at the case, and dropped it. And said, you get no recourse. Because the administration is pro-abortion. It doesn't matter what your belief is, it's what the administration's belief is. So the response to that is pretty straightforward. Allow an individual that has been harmed to have what's called a private right of action. That they don't have to wait for government to intervene on their behalf to have a private right of action, so that an individual, if government doesn't intervene on their behalf, they can intervene. Now, I've brought that to this floor several times, and I've been told that's controversial. That's divisive. And then this week, President Biden signed the Respect for Marriage Act on the White House lawn with a special feature in it called a private right of action. So if individuals that felt, in the language says, felt that they were harmed because of the disagreement of others on their same-sex marriage, they didn't have to wait on government to be able to intervene on their behalf. They could do it. I was told this was belt and suspenders. I was told, of course, the government is going to step in on their behalf, but in case they don't, they need a private right of action so that they can stand up for their own beliefs. Now, it's fascinating to me that what I've asked for people of conscience that don't want to perform abortions but are compelled to do so by their employer, that was a radical concept that we couldn't have a private right of action for them, but it was required in the Respect for Marriage Act. In fact, I brought an amendment to take that out to say, this is going to lead to a lot of lawsuits, and my colleagues said, oh no, and voted against that. So now I'm going to ask a very simple question. Is this body going to give a private right of action to some people they philosophically believe in, but for other people they philosophically don't believe in, don't get that same right? Are we going to discriminate today against people of faith and say, you do not get this right, other people do? That's my simple question for today. Now, this is not a radical request. This is a real-life issue that is occurring right now, where this administration will not intervene on behalf of individuals who have a religious, long-standing moral objection to being compelled to perform an abortion. Let's give them the private right of action so that employers don't feel like this administration can look the other way and they can do whatever they want to their employees or fire them, regardless of what their religious beliefs are. This used to not be a radical concept. It's 92-1. This is not intended to be a radical concept today. It's a simple statement. Is this body going to discriminate against people of faith today? That's my question. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions be discharged from further consideration of S-401, and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection? The senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reserving the right to object. 6 months ago, the Supreme Court ripped away the right to abortion, and since then, Republicans have enacted abortion bans in states across the country. The outcry against Republicans' cruelty has been loud and clear and overwhelming. In every single state where abortion was on the ballot, voters backed abortion rights. They made their voices clear. Women must be able to control their own bodies. They want us to protect abortion access. They want us to stand up against the wave of extreme bans and bills and partisan attacks on abortion and on doctors from Republicans. And that's exactly what this bill is, another attack on abortion that will make it harder for women to get the care that they need. If my colleague really wants to talk about protecting healthcare providers, let's talk about the sharp rise in threats and violence against abortion clinics and what we are doing about that. Let's talk about the providers back home in my home state of Washington who tell me they are worried they could be punished for providing an abortion to patients from out of state. In my state, it's legal. Let's talk about how Republican state lawmakers have already discussed a bill to make it a crime to provide abortion care to a resident, even in another state where it is legal. And yet, if you are one of the many, many doctors and nurses who believe they have a duty to provide abortion care, this bill does nothing to protect you for doing your job, not even if your patient's life is in danger. It is silent on the legal threats that these providers are facing from Republican states, not to mention the increasing physical threats that they face. That violence, that silence speaks volumes about the real point of this bill. And by the way, if you're a patient, well, then the message from this bill is even more clear and even more outrageous. This bill says the ideology of your boss, of your health insurance company, of your pharmacist, or your doctor is more important than your personal decision, your medical needs, or your well-being. Mr. President, that is dangerous, it is wrong, and I will not stand for it. Therefore, I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Apparently, a woman has a right to control her own body unless her boss compels her to perform an abortion. And then she no longer has control of her own body, her boss does. And he can tell her, perform this abortion against your faith or I'll fire you. And that's okay. So choice seems to only go one way. If you choose to perform abortions, you're accepted in our culture. If you believe a child with 10 fingers and 10 toes and a beating heart and unique DNA and a functioning nervous system is actually a child, then you're an outlier and your opinion doesn't count. The only thing that counts is you are compelled to take the life of more children and stand there and watch it. I think that's wrong. No, this bill doesn't get into, as Senator Murray said, it doesn't get into speaking out about the violence against abortion clinics, or quite frankly, get into the violence on pregnancy resource centers who have been firebombed by pro-abortion folks, who have been spray painted, who have threatened and attacked people that want to give sonograms to individuals that are pregnant. It doesn't deal with any of those because, quite frankly, that's a different committee. That's over in the Judiciary Committee. This is a very narrow bill dealing with one simple topic. It doesn't deal with everything on abortion. It doesn't decrease abortions in America. It doesn't do anything like that. It's simple and straightforward. It says, is this government going to compel people to violate their faith? Apparently, the answer today is yes from this body. We don't care what you believe. I think that's sad. And I think that shows how far we've moved as a nation. When it used to be 92-1 that we would say, if you have a different opinion, that's okay in America. But now you can't have a different opinion. That's not right. And I would hope this body would speak out and say at some point, we respect all opinions in America, and would speak out for the right of conscience for people of faith. With that, I yield the floor.